Okay. Just having one person who's having an issue getting in, so I'll just deal with that. Yvonne, don't worry, I cannot hear you, so no problem. Okay. Okay. Louise, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hi.
Oh, okay. Just bear with me a sec. Okay, I am now going to kick us off. So welcome to everybody, whether you're working from home or whether you are working from the office. Unprecedented times, challenging times, and very, very difficult for everyone. But hopefully this will try and make this a little bit engaging to lighten the load. I will admit I have two children here at home. I have got them playing doggy do at the moment upstairs, and I'm hoping they'll be quiet for the next sort of 30, 40 minutes. Unfortunately, hide and seek has kind of run its course. They're bored of me looking for them for 3 hours. So I'll crack on. We're going to talk today about minimizing the risk of fraud. I've run this presentation a number of different times now, but I think it's still very pertinent to what we're, to the current situation. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Louise, who's one of the product managers at InfoTrack, Louise Edwards, and myself. Now, today I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of crime, cyber-enabled crimes, so phishing, etc., things like that. How you can essentially minimize the risk and maybe what you need to do within your own law firms. And then I thought what we'd do is just point, for those of you who don't know, we have a number of different tools within the InfoTrack system. So we'll just point you at those sort of areas, and that's what Louise has joined me to do today, to just show you where they exist. We're not going to talk in detail about those products, and it's not a sale kind of webinar. It's very much an informative webinar, okay? So let's get on with it. Why is it important to understand fraud? Well, I'm sure you probably all are aware of the number of scams that exist out there. And this is recent information here that I'm displaying on the screen. Number of bank transfer scams in the UK rises 40% in a year. During the first 6 months of 2019, we're seeing a lot of law firms targeted with email scams. And it's very dominant. And I think right now, in these challenging times, with maybe an economic downturn, or quite it's there really, isn't it? We're now going to be in an economic downturn. We will suffer more fraud. We will see a rise in that sort of crime over the coming sort of year, I feel. Obviously not always targeted at conveyancers, but it is an easy area for the fraudsters to actually target. And I think really just the global scale of fraud and cybercrime here, this kind of, I will obviously will share these slides with you after the webinar, but really the fraud on a global scale is huge. And I'm not going to go through every single figure here, but it just gives you an insight into the different types of fraud that exist around the world, okay? I think importantly, CFAS have a very clear sort of, talk about it will never happen to me. And what Fran Marwood says is, as the world's 5th largest economy, i.e. the UK, it's no surprise that organisations are seen as an attractive target by global fraudsters. Over half our respondents reported suffering phishing attacks. Now, that surprises me. I would expect phishing attacks to, or a lot of respondents to suffer a lot more phishing attacks, I feel, because it is just such an easy one to do. And we'll go through what a phishing attack is in a short while. But really what she says here is ultimately cyber defense relies on people understanding the threat. So training, awareness and escalation are as important as defensive technology. So obviously with InfoTrack, we've got defensive technology, but the training of staff, the awareness of staff, especially more junior members of staff who maybe aren't as aware of fraud and what fraud actually looks like and what to look for is important. But obviously the process of escalating anything and having logical checks in place within your business are fundamentally important. And the reason they're important is because if you become the victim of fraud, it has a massive risk to your business. It can really damage the reputation of a brand. And obviously, if news comes out and it gets into the media, as it did with that case on Michigan, and I realized Michigan weren't at fault, but certainly it can have a negative impact on that brand, and clients won't necessarily, or become a little bit more wary of dealing with that particular law firm if it's in local press. Whereas a better news story is to be able to say, hey, we combated fraud and we avoided falling into that trap, because that's a better PR story. And ultimately, you know, the cost to repair a damaged reputation or a damaged image is enormous. If you have to rename yourself or rebrand yourself and reposition yourself, it becomes a lot of money there to be spent. Just some stats on conveyancing. I mean, over 223 billion in property transactions exchanged on average every year. That just makes it a very, very easy target for the criminals. And that's why we've seen an exponential increase in conveyancing fraud, ultimately, and I think it's fair to say that a lot of the fraudster scams are becoming a lot more sophisticated than they ever were before. One of the key areas here, as I've already sort of touched on, is actually human error. That's a massive risk factor because people don't know what to look for. So people, process and technology is essentially seen as the golden triangle, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail later on in the presentation. So let's look at the known attacks. These are the attacks I'm going to talk to you about today. There's email fraud, and incorporated within that is phishing. There's cloned websites, bogus firms, malware, ID theft, money laundering, and employee theft. And I think it's pertinent to point out here that sometimes these different types of fraud are commonly interlinked, because an email fraud may lead you to a cloned website of a bogus firm, and how those email frauds become aware is through sort of things like malware, which again I'll explain as we go through the presentation today. So phishing attacks, what are they? What do we need to look out for? Well, really 9 out of 10 cyber attacks actually start with a phishing email. And they are more invasive and more sophisticated. Gone are the days where you have an African prince emailing to say, you know, you can get sort of £10,000. If you pay me £10,000, I'll pay you £1 million and things like that. They are much, much more sophisticated, and I've got some examples of those as we go through the presentation. But really, what should we be looking out for within a phishing email? Well, I'm sure many of you will have seen a phishing email before, but really what you're looking for is poor grammar, poor spelling. Generally, they are asking you to perform an action urgently, and they're giving you a reason to perform that action urgently as well. And the idea of these is really to stop you thinking longer term about what you need to do and just get you to act immediately. So really, these are just a list of different things that you could look out for within a phishing email itself. Here's the whaling. Whaling targets the bigger fish. It's often known as CEO fraud as well. It's a slightly newer type of attack, I suppose. But it essentially, reason it's called whaling is because it targets the big fish in the firm. And just reading this example from Legal Cheek, which is a very recent example, third paragraph down, the fraud arises in the context of someone impersonating a chief exec or a chief financial officer of a company and directing a subsidiary company to make payment in connection with a supposedly confidential purchase of an overseas company. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an overseas company. It could be anything. I see this quite a lot within InfoTrack. We often, our CEO will receive an email or a deemed to be a real email from our CFO, but actually it's not. It's a masked email address. And the example from Legal Cheek here is one where it has identified or used the identities of two city law firms, city law firm partners in a bid to dupe the general public out of their hard-earned cash. It does look to extort money or data very, very quickly. And I think they're the sorts of things that, you know, we all have to be very aware of. So if anyone's ever asking for payment, it is very much worth picking up the phone to ensure that that is the case. Another type of email fraud, it's not always going to necessarily target the law firm either. This is an example of Woodford solicitors who were essentially tricked into sending £600,000 to fraudsters. Essentially what happened was the fraudsters duplicated or made up a new email address for Nicola McConnell, but with one letter different in the email address. And then they sent an email to the law firm to say, you know, use these details to transfer money into, which the law firm duly then processed. And this is a good example of where it's very easy to be tricked because we don't always check the name that we're responding to in an email that comes through. And obviously McConnell is quite a difficult one because if you lose an L, you would possibly never really notice that. So it's always worthwhile either picking up the phone to the client and explaining and asking them if they've changed their email address or if they have actually asked for that. But it's also very important at this stage, had Woodford's maybe performed a client, a bank account check, essentially checking that bank account existed and was in use, they may have protected themselves from losing that money. And we'll talk a little bit about bank account checker in a little while. Ultimately, you know, phishing and whaling and email fraud, nobody's immune. You know, to the Woodfords example, it's the client that's not immune either. So we really have to educate the client, and it's unfortunately, it's probably not just a case of sending them a letter to de-risk yourself. You've got to talk them through it. You've got to talk to them about what the potential risks are that exist to them as well when they're dealing with money. I've got a couple of examples here of this COVID-19, this coronavirus issue that we have going on right now, and they give you good examples of phishing emails where they've emailed people to say, you know, you're going to get a tax refund, but you actually have to do that now. That's attractive at this time, especially with many people now going furlough or losing their jobs. You know, to get that, they react very quickly to that and will click those links. It's never worth doing this. Yeah, we actually should be going off to a website and using a trusted source. If something looks too good to be true, it possibly is. So never click the link within the email address. Never use a number contained within the email either there, unless it's a number that you know off the top of your heads. So that's the advice for phishing, whaling, and for email fraud there. I think the next thing to go on to is a lot of the phishing emails will take you to what are known as cloned websites. So this is websites whereby they've been created by a fraudster to look very, very similar to the website of the actual law firm itself. This is an older example here of a cloned website, but I think it's still very pertinent. I know the SRA have stepped up a lot of efforts in preventing sort of cloned websites and bogus law firms, but it still exists and it's still important to go through this, I feel. So looking at these two, which one would you say is the cloned website, isn't the cloned website? And I know you can't tell me because I can't hear you, so I'll show you now. The cloned website is on the right-hand side. Ultimately, you wouldn't ever really know that that is a cloned website, unfortunately, because it's very, very similar. And people won't know what to necessarily look for. how would you know if your website's being cloned? Well, you probably won't at this moment in time. I mean, an example of cloned websites where they get very smart is that they spend money in SEO to make sure that their cloned website appears above the real law firm's websites in anything here. But there are some tools around to help you identify if your site has been cloned, and I've just listed them in here. So, first of all, it's not always a guarantee, but when you're on a website, if it's got HTTP : / that means that it's not a secure site, it's not got a security certificate attached to it. If you go to a bank website, for example, it will always have HTTPS, which means it's a secure site. So always look out for that, but it's not always a guarantee. There are some sites out there that help you identify if your site has been cloned, including Copyscape. I've included some details in the appendix here. And also who is hosting this will help you discover who is actually hosting a website that stole your design, if that is the case. Moving on to those cloned websites are generally the property of bogus firms, and this is a good example here is where they steal the identity of the solicitor and the firm. And a good example is the Regis Michael example. And I'm going to talk about Bold Legal Group in a little while. Hopefully many of you will already be using Bold Legal Group or be a member of Bold Legal Group. If you aren't, it's probably worth having a look into. But that's Rob Halstone. So essentially with the Regis Michael example, a partner in Bold Legal Group, member firm, was recently approached on LinkedIn by a firm in Bognor Regis calling themselves Regis Michael LLP, who appeared to be on a fishing expedition, as we call it. Something didn't feel right about it, and upon inspection, the actual website was lacking somewhat in substance, so it looked like a bogus website. Rob made email contacts with Regis Michael, asking for a conveyancing quote and details of their lender panel involvement, and if they were SRA CLC regulated. So he made contact with what was meant to be this phony firm, or expected to be phony. The early and very quick email responses stopped abruptly when James Buckley was pushed for regulatory information about his firm. The BLG tried to enter into a telephone conversation, but could only get voicemail only. And he was only successful in having a brief web chat when it ended again abruptly when the firm was pushed for more regulatory information. Rob, having given the firm time to respond to requests for evidence as their geniuses, they had little doubt that it was actually a phishing exercise. So therefore the relevant authorities, SRA, were contacted, and hopefully that was then pushed out. But that shows a good example of how firms operate, or how bogus firms operate, but also how there are tools out there that can help you in the likes of Rob Halstone's Bold Legal Group bulletin. Sorry, bear with me. And another example here is of a firm who actually, they used Lawyer Checker, and they were actually able to prevent losing the client money because fraudsters had compromised the email exchange, but they checked with Lawyer Checker to make sure that the other law firm was operational and had a fully functioning bank account, but actually didn't. So that Lawyer Checker does absolutely help law firms or helps law firms to avoid sending monies out to bogus law firms, because it is money that is very, very difficult to then get back. So minimizing the threat. So the advice here really is to use Lawyer Checker where necessary, and really use it all the time. It's a minimal cost for what is a very good service and could just reduce that risk. Always use your network of contacts. If you know of a law firm who's close, if you feel that there's a law firm close by or is potentially bogus, it is maybe worth contacting a firm that's close by to that firm to ask them if they think it's real. And if not, then maybe you need to go and look for telephone numbers from reputable sources such as the Law Society. And you can also obviously therefore go to Bold Legal Group as well. Sorry, bear with me, flips over there. I think it's really important to outline the threats to your own clients and inform them of these different types of things that can happen. And if you're slightly unsure of any inbound calls coming in, just use a different phone number. There is examples of people who have been left hanging and you pick it up and it's the fraudsters on the line, but just make sure that you're using telephone numbers. Go and visit websites, check that HTTPS and get the phone number from that website. Just as you protect your own money, it's about protecting your firm, the reputation and your clients as well. A little bit more about Lawyer Checker in terms, because we are asked quite often what sources they use or what sources they check. This is a list of databases that they actually look for: SRA, CQS, Excel, and transfers of value, sort code lookup, and so on. So there is a nice list there. They do a very, very good job of keeping up to date with all of these different areas as well. So moving on to malware. Now, malware is malicious software, basically, so it's just a shortening of that. But malware involves a number of, or sees a couple of different things. There's viruses, there's spyware, and there's ransomware as well. It's also used within sort of more sophisticated scams now, but viruses are Trojans and worms that infect your PC, which is why we've got antivirus software, or why you should have antivirus software. Spyware infiltrate programs and look at the details that you're entering into anything there as well. And obviously ransomware is quite common. It's probably more common than we like to think about, but ransomware actually locks down your PC. So, and it makes all the files unaccessible until maybe you pay out a ransom. It could be as little as £100, it could be in the thousands, it could be even more than that. I think the more recent example of that was a Travelex firm that got locked down. It was attacked and it got locked down, and it really takes them out of business for a number of days. And there's an example there of a firm that was attacked with ransomware as well. This is where cloud technology comes in, and where cloud technology is very good because it's saved in the cloud, which means that it's actually protected. We use servers that are ISO 2000, whatever the latest version of that is. I can't remember straight off the top of my head. 27001, ISO 27001, which has all the latest security protocols on it, just so as you're aware. And here's an example of malware being used in the real world. I'm sure many of you would have read this. This is from the 3rd of March 2020, so very, very recent. And great news, the fraudsters were actually captured and jailed, but this quintet had already committed 235 separate frauds. And I'll just read that fourth paragraph. The gang used malware to steal login details of email accounts belonging to businesses and private individuals worldwide. They would monitor the chosen email accounts for high-value financial transactions, then intercept conversations and send spoof emails, so that victims were duped into paying funds into one of the 100 UK-based mule bank accounts controlled by the fraudsters. So this is an example of where you have essentially, malware, but interlinked with email fraud as well. And this is what I mean about it becoming more and more sophisticated in the world. And I think here, there's two charts here. So where is malware? Malware, well, first of all, we can see the global cost of malware. In 2019, it was 2 trillion. That's up from 500 billion in 2015. And it's projected to be around 6 trillion in 2021. Malware tends to come from email. It tends to be an email whereby it contains an attachment, and the minute that attachment is opened, it will then infect the PC. Now, having obviously antivirus software will protect against that, but obviously many of us will remember the NHS being locked down due to a ransomware attack last year. That is very much the case, and that is because the NHS had not updated their PCs with the latest antivirus software to protect against that, because they scheduled it, and unfortunately there was just a window of opportunity that led to that locking down the NHS. I think something that many people don't always appreciate, but if we do know, because we can see from Google Analytics what browsers, what web browsers people are actually using. And we have a number of clients, and they're probably not on this call actually, but we have a number of clients still using the likes of Internet Explorer 9, Internet Explorer 10. Well, really those websites are out of date and they're not supported, and they don't have the security behind them. We absolutely must make sure that we're downloading and using the latest versions of browsers, whether that's Internet Explorer, whether that's Chrome, whether that's Firefox or Safari or something else. If you're not using cloud technology, make sure you're backing up files regularly on a regular basis, but really importantly, ensuring that staff know to take care in opening attachments is crucial. If they don't think it's real, it probably isn't, and therefore it should be removed. But using systems to try and send and receive documentation more so is becoming more important, which is why we've introduced the new onboarding software, which includes the property information forms that avoids any Word documentation being sent out and about as well, and just supports. Okay, so there's just a quick question there. How do you check that you have the latest browser version? It very much depends on which browser you have as to how you can find out. But if in Internet Explorer, you essentially should go to help or tools. And it should then provide you with a little bit more detail as to which browser it is. But I can send you a few more details on that a little bit later on. Tends to be that Chrome updates itself. So Chrome is always a better one to use, in my honest opinion, because it updates itself on a regular basis anyway. We'll find out the latest version of Internet Explorer, because I should have had that information to hand. Apologies. So just moving on to identity theft now, and minimizing the risk here. Here's an example of where ID theft can actually be happen. And here's an example. There was £333,000 sent to a fraudster account because the client email was hacked. So essentially the fraudsters pretended to be that particular client, and unfortunately no checks were carried out to confirm the bank account details were those of the actual client itself. Now that's not necessarily only bank account checker, but that's actually picking up the phone, detailing it, and actually capturing that somewhere within your case management system. And this is a firm that just didn't do any of that. And again here, identity theft can be achieved through the whaling by extracting data from executives. So it's really important to make sure that we're looking after our data as well. And similarly, AML, obviously, I think most people are very aware of AML and the threats around that. There's a nice stat here: around 1.1 to 2% of all property transactions in the UK are directly funded by criminal activity, which is roughly 150 to 300,000 pounds of properties per year. Now, importantly, that's not just property transactions in conveyancing, that's obviously rentals and commercial and residential. So it's an amalgamation, but the threat is very, very real in terms of AML. And it's just likely to be that one time that we don't look for it, that it actually happens. That little map there shows fraud hotspots around the UK, and that is from 2019. Obviously, London and the Southeast is a hotbed of activity, but there's not an area really that doesn't suffer anything. There's less in Scotland, less in the North Northeast and Wales, but actually to some degree, if we're from those areas, they are areas where fraudsters could potentially move into as well. So identity theft and AML, minimizing that threat. So essentially just making sure you know what to check in terms of identification. Do you know how many pages there should be in a passport? Do you know it should have rounded corners, not square corners? Do you know what you're actually looking for within a passport? Now, the great news is that there's better software coming to support sort of the identification of ID and identification of people, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. Importantly, never share personal details via email. So always tell your clients, you'll always ignore any bank account details that come out in any kind of email. Use antivirus software, perform your necessary anti-money laundering checks. Louise is going to show that in a mo, and obviously perform your client's accounts checker as well to make sure that your client's account does exist, especially if they tell you that it's then changed, but it should be done. It's a part of the due diligence process. Okay, so let's move on to employee theft. Unfortunately, this is, I mean, it's a contentious issue, but unfortunately it does exist. With nearly 1 in 5 small businesses having actually been defrauded by an employee. There are many examples in conveyancing and law firms of individuals duping their own firm or their own business that they work for into and defrauding them. But it is important to know that employees can be on scams. And I've written here, employees who have criminal records. I am not saying that everyone who has a criminal record doesn't change and doesn't actually do something. We should allow that to happen. But I think it's just important to state here that we just have to keep an eye on all employees and have a good process in place to make sure that any fraudulent activity is picked up early on. And I've got 2 examples here because it's not just the individual working for a law firm, but it can actually be the law firm itself who's working with gangs too. And that's that first example, with the headline "On the Fiddle, Massive buy-to-let fraud exposed in court." This is a conveyancer who was absolutely complicit in helping criminals actually take away money, deposits placed where true sources of funds were disguised from lenders. He did 80 transactions and he was jailed for 7 years, and you can read a little bit more on that. But essentially that is, there are law firms out there operating who are actively involved in gangs to take money away. And there's another example here, recent example of a solicitor who was hoodwinked by a bogus employee, resulting in the dissipation of over £1 million of client money. They've been struck off. There's more detail there as to what actually took place there. There was a recent example, well, I say recent, there was an example about 1.5 years ago of a conveyancer who had actually been struck off from or been banned and sacked by a number of different conveyancing firms. Her name was Anya, but she'd basically got another job with another conveyancer who hadn't performed a necessary background check. And then extorted a little bit of money. Fortunately, she was caught and she was reported, and she was subsequently jailed as well, obviously. But essentially, how do we minimize the threat of employees? And again, I think it's an education piece here. It's not necessarily, accusing people or making sure that they're coming down hard on them, but it's about educating them in terms of why there are these checks in place. So as it almost puts off any fraudulent activity by any individual. But we do have to carry out pre-employment checks. We do have to have anti-fraud policy statements. We do have to keep an eye on, identify any unusual staff behaviour that's out of the ordinary. We know people, we work with people every day, so it is easier to sometimes spot something that they're doing that's maybe out of the ordinary, out of the norm, if you like. And I think also it's about introducing processes and controls here in order to reduce that potential. So ultimately, what are we actually saying here? Well, really, this is the golden triangle that I talked about earlier, which is people, technology, and process. For any kind of fraud and to reduce it, this should be adopted by every firm, and it probably is, but we probably need to necessarily maybe look at what we're doing within each of these, not on an annual basis, but more on, I would actually say, a quarterly basis to make sure that it still stands true. So, people, are we educating people? Have we got new starters on that onboarding journey of onboarding new starters? Are we explaining to them the process and what to look for within any fraud? Process, have we got a nicely defined process to approve any monies, to make sure that the necessary checks are being carried out, or are we winging it really? So that's something that we need to think about. And then finally, technology. So making sure that you've actually got the right technology in place to carry out these different checks, which is where obviously InfoTrack are trying to support you and are looking to invest to support you as well, which Louise will talk a little bit more about in a mo. So really preventing online attacks, as I say, it's an ongoing process. It's not something that you can do within a single day. It's very much about education. Attending some people on this webinar may have seen this presentation before. I've obviously updated some of the, or most of the examples, but fundamentally, that shows that fraud is still happening. It's still going on. And I'm not seeing the fraud that's actually prevented from happening either here. I'm not talking about that side of things. Understanding the evolving risks and how these fraud types, or these types of fraud actually evolve, is important. So making sure that you're attending these sorts of things on a regular basis is important. Using the tools that you have available to you, Lawyer Checker, AML, client account checker, but also using the likes of Bold Legal Group and your network of contacts. Hence why I say there, pick up the phone, check it again. Making sure your antivirus software is up to date, making sure your browsers are up to date. And I can't stress this enough, crime will go up in any kind of downturn, and therefore antivirus software, browsers are fundamentally important right now and going forwards. Making sure that you've got a security policy that's ingrained within your firm's DNA, and also just having an incident response plan. So if your data isn't backed up on the cloud, what if you were to be locked down today, what would you do? What's your next step? What's your next course of action there? I know I would think that many of you are using the cloud, and that's great news. So now I'm just going to pass over to, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. I've got one more slide after Louise has spoken. Louise is just going to quickly show you, well, Lou, I'll let you explain. I'll mute myself off and let you go.
Thanks, Adam. So hopefully you can all see my screen here. So again, I'm Louise, I'm product manager over here at InfoTrack. I'm really pleased to be running through our risk mitigating products with you essentially today. So that comprises of our new and improved anti-money laundering searches, the client bank account checker product, and the lawyer checker product as well. So just using our demo site here, our new AML searches just sit on the navigation bar at the top of the screen and also within the workflows for both purchases and sales, obviously to kick off your transaction. We've partnered with Searches Group for our anti-money laundering searches, and this comprises of personal, UK-based company searches and international searches as well. So a couple of updates and enhancements really to the submitting of the anti-money laundering searches is the ability to search for enhanced information essentially. So a more thorough report that can actually incorporate alias names. So initially and traditionally AML searches have obviously just searched against name and address, but obviously where people will often flick and update, say, a maiden name when they get married, or if they're known by, say, a Matt and Matthew scenario and they just wanted to search by additional alias as well, you can now input an alias name or say unknown if not required. And the same with residency. If your clients have recently moved into a new property or they've been renting or something like that, you've got the option to say how long your clients have been occupying that current address, so less than a year or more than a year. So this sort of enhanced information and more thorough information is going to give you a more thorough report because you're able to input more details straight from the outset when you're going through to order your searches. In addition to that as well, to help sort of mitigate the risk of human, I guess, intervention and human error when submitting the searches, international searches will now be updated and will now be sort of selected depending on the current address and the current residency of your client. So obviously you can select UK at the top, but if going into any other countries where your clients are residing, that will automatically update the product to do an international search. Before, and again historically, the searches are sort of left up to the user, left up to your teams to decide what type of search they should be doing, whereas now it's all embedded as part of the workflow. So taking out that kind of manual human decision of sort of the transaction to sort of mitigate risk and have that consistency there. Once all of the fields have then been filled out, obviously you can go in and select the risk assessment type, which can be customizable, obviously, for each of your clients, or sort of search types where necessary. And this will then allow you to upload the relevant documents, so relevant ID and address documentation that you've received for your clients. As with everything sort of within InfoTrack, obviously the information that gets input into the ordering screen can pre-populate from either case management system or from previously known information if you're accessing direct via the website. Again, pointing to that same sort of single source of truth, mitigating risk of manually inputting incorrect information and potentially affecting obviously the results of the search. The search that will come back will then either be compliant or non-compliant, and you'll have the confirmation of all of the information which was submitted, and this will go into the further detail about whether your client has appeared on any sort of PEPs or sanctions list, and the validations, whether they've passed or failed, and just going into all the sort of granular detail and further information on the documents submitted, and then sort of financial share records and the rest of the information there. So once the results come back, obviously we can see a compliant result here. We've put a lot of tools into the system that will not only help you obviously submit the searches, but also help you manage them as well. So that primarily will come in the form of the AML dashboard, which we've released along with the new product. And this will show you all of your compliant, non-compliant, and new alerts. So new alerts, obviously, as soon as you submit your search for your client, it's not just that we're doing the search at that particular moment in time, we actually do the ongoing monitoring for that client. So in order to be compliant with the EU's 4th and 5th directive, we want to make sure that your client's names and details are being monitored throughout the life cycle of the transaction. So if at any time your client, say, does appear on a PEPs and sanctions list, or say even their documentary evidence has expired, we just want to notify you to let you know that essentially there is an update on your client, the status has essentially changed. So you will receive an email notification, almost like what we do with the requisitions that we'll send over from Land Registry. You'll have an email immediately notifying you that your client's results have essentially changed, and then it may change the compliancy status of the actual result and might flip it to non-compliant. So the AML dashboard is a really easy way for you to have that high level overview and be able to manage all of your clients at any given time. And if you just wanted to review the non-compliant results, you know, a lot of the questions around AML searches will be that, okay, I've received my referred, my non-compliant result back, what do I do now? So this is where our update feature basically comes into effect. So this is a really useful tool for you to be able to see, obviously, the result that's come back for your client is non-compliant. This client has been found against financial sanction information. So the update service is basically a way for you to be able to input your justification for essentially continuing to work with a client. So it will say that you satisfied various elements of your client, that they're not subject to potentially the warning that came through, you've done sort of further information, you can add in a supporting message and then submit your request, and that will basically generate a compliant result for you. So this is a really handy audit trail, again, having that consistency, having it all in one place for you to be able to monitor and update all of your results. So if you're happy to proceed with that client, you can obviously keep everything within InfoTrack, and again, that one-stop shop for also managing the results that are going through. Everyone within the firm will also obviously be able to see all of the kind of updates and alerts which have come through. And as part of the management tools, we've built in the All Related Files tab. So this will show you the initial result, any alerts which have come through on your client, and any update details as well, along with any sort of documents which have been uploaded as part of the initial request. So this again provides a one-stop shop, single source of truth for all the files that are in relation to this client. There's no need to go sort of sorting through your file, your matter or anything to sort of find all of the information and justification for proceeding with this client. It's all contained within one handy place within the dashboard that you have control over and will always have visibility over for you and your teams. So moving on to the client bank account checker. So again, this product sits within the home screen really nicely, and the information again will either pre-populate from case management system or from other products that you've used within the system if you access obviously directly to InfoTrack via our website. The information that's collected is again name, date of birth, address, and sort code and account number. The client bank account checker is basically a risk management tool that checks the validity of your client's bank account details. So this obviously again ensures transmission of funds being sent to the correct location and the correct account. So again, the information will pre-populate, the documents will be returned to you via email and pushed back into your case management system. And all of the information provided comes via GBG Group from Equifax as the data source. So it's a really easy way to ensure that the money is going to the right place. And just to show you essentially what the results look like. So we'll pass through essentially the result codes that have come back for this client. So we can verify if the sort code has passed, obviously in conjunction with provided account number, and just verify that the account is sort of active and matches all of the information that was input. For a referred result, it will just flag any warnings where, say, the system can't determine the sort code verification or the bank account information as well. And again, all of this information will push back into your case management system and will be emailed over to you where necessary. And then just to finish off with Lawyer Checker, so the account and entity screening from Lawyer Checker is again another risk management solution, similarly to check the validity of the account details of the solicitors on the other side of the transaction, as Adam sort of went into a bit of detail earlier. So in terms of ordering, obviously simple information that you'll input, firm name, completion date, address of the solicitors on the other side, and the account details and the SRA or CLC number. So the information that then gets returned from Lawyer Checker, the results of the search will either be sort of frequent, infrequent, or unknown. Frequent is a good record of conveyancing transactions from the Lawyer Checker database and will sort of show the frequency that information's been going in and out of that account. Infrequent says that the track record has been identified, but not all the checks have been able to pass. So further information and further checks are sort of done on the account, but those haven't all passed. Additional notices for infrequent results will be passed through at a later date. So there's a 4-hour turnaround time just to pass over sort of some granular detail essentially on why the search has been issued infrequent. And then unknown. So there's no track record in Lawyer Checker's databases, Adam went through earlier. It's suggested obviously to fully review the file for risk indicators, obviously for other areas of the transaction, and also you'll receive sort of further additional notices within the system once that's been issued. So again, that's just sort of a brief high-level overview of the tools that we have over here at InfoTrack to help you sort of mitigate risk, and everything's all sort of within InfoTrack as a one-stop shop for the system. I'll hand back over to Adam now just to finish off.
Thank you, Lou. I'll just go back to showing my screen. Just bear with me because it's got a couple of questions actually, Lou. While quickly, can you check client accounts which are international? Was one of the questions. Do you want to just quickly answer that?
Yeah, at the moment, I believe they are just UK-based account details, but I can double check on that and send out to the team.
Thank you. Okay. And another question there is, why is Lawyer Checker more expensive than using through Lender Exchange or LMS? I quickly answer that question, Stephen. I understand that it's due to different data sources that they look up. And I know that Lawyer Checker is fundamentally more expansive in the data sources that it checks. but also it obviously provides you with that check on the outset, up front to check it, but it obviously provides you with that further check further down the line just before you transfer the monies, just to double check that that account actually exists. So it's a lot more insightful and checks a lot more data sources, and obviously every data source that we have to check, there becomes a cost associated with that. So I hope that answers your question. So there's not too much more from me. You'll be delighted to know. Thank you for everyone for your time. So I thought what I'd do is just outline a number of different websites that you can go to and look for a little bit more information around Lawyer Checker. I included the Bold Legal Group link in there as well. If you're not with Bold, give Rob a call, tell him InfoTrack sent you, and he'll be delighted to hear from you. It's a very small cost a year. I think it's like 300 quid for a firm to use that per year, and it's worthwhile. It gives you a lot more information than just fraud as well. Basic passport checks, what to look for. InfoTrack, our events page, obviously keep on top of that, and the Law Society web kit as well. And so that's the end of the webinar. I mean, obviously we're doing a few more of these. We will be running this one again in a few weeks' time. So if you've got colleagues who want to attend, then do let them know. And if you've got any further questions, please do contact myself or Louise. I did promise to try and keep this brief, but I think there are some other questions, and I will try and deal with those outside of this particular webinar. But if you've got any questions, feel free to contact the account managers, the help desk, or use any of those phone numbers there, or myself and obviously Louise to contact. Thank you everybody for your time. I hope you're all safe. I hope you're all doing well. I better go and make sure that the kids are doing okay. So thank you for your time, and I'll end the webinar now. Thank you. Goodbye.